It's hard to believe, but early on in Acts, there was a debate about whether the gospel was meant as a purely Jewish message or if it was meant for nations outside of the Jews, uh, which are, of course, termed as Gentiles. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with that term, a Gentile is anyone who is just not Jewish. So the majority of the world are Gentiles. I am a Gentile. I'm sure many of you out there are as well. And this story that Peter tells, which we get in more detail in an earlier passage in Acts, is an example of one of these first early instances where the apostles were actually going out and ministering to the Gentiles. And this was met with a lot of tension and opposition because you have to understand in the Jewish faith, a lot of the kind of talk about Gentiles is that they weren't Jewish, that they were kind of unclean, that they were impure, that they were pagan. They had these rituals that were not in line with Jewish thought, and oftentimes would make it so that you yourself, by being around them, just couldn't worship. And so, as a sect that saw themselves as Jewish, which the early church did, uh, Peter going and doing this was somewhat scandalous. They were worried not just that, they were not just, opposed to him going and preaching the word to the Gentiles. They were worried that by doing this, he was going to cause them to maybe be singled out and persecuted as well. Now, of course, this is, as Peter tells the story, they realize that no, this is God's hand working here and they should support it. But it's easy for us to just kind of look at this and think that they themselves were, maybe being a little too judgmental, but there was some logic behind what they were saying. With that being said, this did go against what Jesus had called them to do. Before Jesus left, as we hear in the Gospel of Matthew, he gave the Great Commission, which was to go out and make disciples of all nations, not just Israel, not just the Jews. It was all nations. He was very specific about that. And so this is kind of the first fruits of that whole Great Commission that we see going on. This, as well as Paul himself, he would go out and minister to the Gentiles, and they would have some conflict as well. And this was a little bit of an issue while in the early church that we tend to kind of forget about and maybe don't appreciate as much, even though for many of us, it's incredibly important. The fact that they worked through these things is the reason why all of us believe, well, many of us believe. Now, what does this mean for us today? Well, very simply, the gospel is an inclusive message. It is not something that is to be kept away from people because we don't happen to like who they are or how they act, or they seem a little different than us. We should be willing to spread the word of God, to spread the good news to anyone and everyone, because that is what we have been called to do, and it is what we see these apostles themselves doing. So with that, I would like to invite you all to join me for our last song today.